Welcome to a special episode of Uncorked, the Cult Wines podcast. We are reviewing 2025, a year in review, the wine market, what happened. It is the beginning of January. It's the start of a new year. We enter 2026 with a huge amount of optimism. But we have a big job to do. We need to review what happened in 2025. And I'm very fortunate to be joined by one of our first, I suppose, podcast guest, but was a co-host on the original episode one. Joe Alim is in the UK, and he's joining me in London to be on this very special episode of Uncorked podcast. Great to have you again, Joe.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be back. Got me back on after one episode and then a bit of a hiatus for another 7, but I've been invited back, which is good.
Yeah, I mean, luckily you're only in the UK once a year, so we only have to extend this invitation once. And I think that's about what our listeners can put up with on a regular basis. But let's see. I don't know. Maybe you could get yourself back in the mixer.
Okay, yeah.
But look, I mean, it's a very serious topic today. We needed someone who had the right pedigree to come in and really get into the data, go through the spreadsheets, and kind of pull out the insights and the interesting bits of information that our listeners are going to be dying to hear about. Before we get started and looking at the data side of things, and obviously we have got a lot of data to bring you. What were your general thoughts about 2025? I mean, what's your reflections now that we are, in the beginning of 2026, 2025 is in the bank?
Yeah.
What's your lasting memories of the year from a wine market perspective?
Look, I think it was a very difficult year following on from 2024. I think there's no hiding from the fact that 2025, certainly for the first 3 quarters of the year, which we'll probably come on to a bit later on, was really challenging because, the difficult conditions persisted. That being said, I think that, towards the end of the year, what we hoped would happen was that the wine market would start to turn a corner, and it absolutely did. And now it's really starting to build momentum. And I think that, probably a time for a lot of reflection throughout 2025, people really trying to understand what it is they want to buy, how they want to buy, taking some time to really take stock of, how they want to approach their portfolio, how they want to approach their drinking collection. And I think that's really now set the platform for almost like a new cycle, a new period where I think we're going to see some new trends develop, and I think we're already starting to see that momentum build.
Are we seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, Joe?
We're absolutely seeing some light at the end of the tunnel.
That's what people want to hear at home, I think.
Yeah. The headline indices have started to rise in value, but actually the more important thing is under the bonnet, the trading data, the volume of trades, the liquidity is all starting to tick up.
Yeah.
Everything is looking a lot more positive. So I think certainly for you and I, that's where we want to be.
Yeah.
I think for probably everyone listening to this podcast, that's where we want to be.
Yeah.
Look, long may it continue. But I think that we can confidently sit here and say that, sentiment has actually shifted now.
Yeah.
And we're moving in the right direction, which is great.
So my wife at home, she likes to play a little game. Not that type of game. Get your head out of the gutter. When we go on holidays, we go to other people's weddings. When we just spend time at home over the Christmas period, she normally asks me a very specific question at the end of it. She says, "What is your peak or your pit of a particular trip?" So my question to you is, what was your peak and what was your pit of 2025 in terms of the wine market?
So look, I think the peak came towards the end.
Crescendo, build it up.
Yeah, absolutely. From a wine market investment perspective, I think seeing some of the names that we know we're about to increase, some of the bigger names starting to increase is really, really encouraging.
Yeah.
Looking at some of the data and seeing that Salon 2002 is starting to trade up, looking at the data and seeing that, some of the leading Bordeaux...
Spoiler alert.
leading Bordeaux names are starting to trade up. I think for me, a massive sense of relief, to be honest with you, after a long period of time, knowing that those wines are starting to trade up. Pit. I think some of the en primeur pricing was a bit of a pit for me. There was a lot of excitement for that. We were really waiting for it, and I think there was an opportunity to actually kickstart the market recovery earlier. Yeah, and it was just a bit of a damp squib, wasn't it?
Yeah,
a lot of that, and I thought that was really disappointing. So I'd probably categorize some of those bigger names coming out too expensive as
Yeah.
a bit of a low point.
No, it was good ones. I think maybe another. Well, the one I was thinking about in terms of for a pit was probably the Trump tariffs earlier in the year.
Oh yeah.
Because I felt like, and maybe the data will show us a little bit when we get into it, but I felt like 2025 for me actually didn't start too badly. I felt like we were kind of in a similar position this time last year, at the end of 24, coming into the new year. Obviously, you start every new year with a little bit of optimism. And January was actually pretty good. February, we started. I mean, obviously you're based in Asia, but we certainly started to see the Asia market get back into the swing of things, especially on the trade side. And it felt like there was a little bit of trading coming back in. You know, prices were starting to get supported again, and it felt like the air in the balloon was just completely let out in between kind of March and April and May, when we had that complete uncertainty around the whole tariffs. And it's amazing to think that was only sort of 7-8 months ago. Like how much that time that took up and focus, and it was almost like everyone took their chips off the table for a period of time. It was almost kind of that the stasis it created. I know it kind of dovetailed into that kind of entrepreneur period of time as well, which kind of then almost probably made it worse, because you kind of came off the back of the whole uncertainty around tariffs into an entrepreneur campaign that kind of fell a little bit flat. It was kind of like a bit of a death by 1,000 cuts, but that was probably the pit of the year. My peak, you didn't ask for it, but I'll give it to you anyway. My peak of the year was some of the auction results, I think, towards the end of the year. In particular, we saw some very old Latache sold at a record price at auction. I think it was over 300,000 it sold for one single bottle. And look, I think in terms of how much impact does that have on the actual everyday wine market, obviously it doesn't have a huge impact. You don't see these types of artifacts, if we can call it that, come onto the market very often. But I think what it showed is that at the very top of the fine wine market, there is still appetite there. And I think when you go through such a long period of sort of, negative market cycle, you can kind of lose a little bit of that sort of belief and confidence in the market. And I think something that I mentioned to you, I'm part of a few different kind of wine WhatsApp groups, and I think anecdotally, like for me, towards the end of the year, it felt like everyone was back out drinking wine again. And again, I didn't feel like I'd seen a lot of that for a while. And, I was fortunate to go a couple of tastings and people opening some really great bottles. But it felt, again, like second to last part of the year, it suddenly felt like there was a bit more renewed enthusiasm, people going to auctions again. Like I said, that Latache price maybe being the headline grabber. But on top of that, just anecdotally, people, wanting to organise like a Jaillard tasting, people that wanted to organise a Loire Dauphiné tasting, people actually opening these bottles again. That, again, I mentioned between me and you chatting on WhatsApp and other kind of messaging services, kind of going, I haven't seen that for a while. Yeah. And I think that was, in a way, that was more of a peak for me, because I feel like when you do look at the data and you look at the market, yes, that you're always looking at after the event. Yeah. If you look at prices or trades, the event's already happened. So we're kind of reporting on things that have already happened. Yeah. But I'm always equally interested and intrigued by the leading indicators. Yeah. And for me, that's always been a leading indicator. You want to see people opening these bottles. You want to see these people coming back into the auction. You want to see wines bid up. You want to see on social media certain labels being shown, and yes, it's maybe got a little bit of that kind of egotistical kind of showing off aspect to it, but in a way that it, for us, especially in the fine wine market, it does tend to suggest you're getting into a healthier place, that people are opening these bottles, they're emptying their cellars, and that results in one or two things. It means they're going to start replenishing, and maybe other people that haven't tasted those particular wines or labels might be starting to look for them or seeking them out from the market. So that was kind of my peak, which I think probably aligns a little bit with you, which is kind of that last quarter of the year kind of gave us a lot of kind of hope and optimism. I think
that's a really good point, because look, the last few years we know how popular the top wines are, and they have been for a really long time. Yeah, and it's been somewhat of a hiatus of people going out and drinking them in the kind of volume they were doing, pre-2022. Yeah. And I think you and I knew that the demand and the passion for those wines hadn't gone anywhere. Yeah. But the longer it goes on, the kind of slightly more nervous you get from the fact that is the market going to come back for this? So absolutely to come in and see people drinking those wines again is really encouraging, for sure.
Well, look, let's give our listeners a little bit of background in terms of what we've actually done, what we've compiled. So since the end of the year, we've put together some data. We've got our computers in front of us, which is not very Uncorked podcast. But I'm looking at a spreadsheet here with 50,000 rows in it, with wines and vintages and data and a huge amount of information. So
sometimes you have to get into the weeds.
You have to get into the weeds, but luckily for you listening at home, you don't have to get into the weeds. We'll surface our finds from the deep for you. Is that a good anecdote? I'm not sure. But yeah, no. So we looked at the data, and what we're looking at is, okay, how's the overall market fared? What's been trading? How's that changed from this year to last year? Whether that's volume or value. We're also looking at from a regional perspective. Then we've gone into, as I said, we've gone into the weeds a little bit. We looked at what are the top traded wines of the year. So which wines traded the most in 2025. Of course, we're looking at what the best performers were in terms of price performance. We're also looking at a couple of different categories. So we came up with this idea of a velocity list, where we sort of combined price appreciation with how much the wines have been trading. We also came up with a market movers list, which kind of focused a little bit more on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of more of the rarer collectible wines, higher value wines, and again looking at how much value of those wines traded in the market versus the previous year, as well as the price change. As well as that, we've looked at sort of the highest rises of the year. So what was the first trade of the year versus the last trade of the year? So where can we see that kind of watermark getting pushed up the most? Which will be interesting because I think it hopefully should paint a little bit of a picture of what me and Joe talked about in terms of Q4 being probably the most positive period of the market for 2025. And finally, we're going to be looking at sort of quarter on quarter performance. So just looking at like Q3 into Q4, looking at what were the wines that were trading up in that last quarter of the year, and what are the trends around that. And yeah, I mean, hopefully that will be interesting for people. And if it's not, we will be making it into reports. You can just download it and read it yourself if you don't want to listen to us talk about it. Yeah, I mean, hopefully, we obviously looked at the data, we've looked at the output, and there's definitely some interesting trends to talk about and articulate to you, our listeners. Was there anything I missed?
No, I think you're good.
Comprehensive.
Comprehensive, yeah. That's it. There we go. And that's us.
And that's it. Tune in next year. So look, top wines of 2025. I mean, might as well kick off with the top level stats. Good news and bad news. Bad news. Okay, look. Overall performance. So tracking, I think there was over 9,902 wines traded in 2025 that also didn't traded in 2024. So overall, if you look at the average price change of those 10,000 wines, it was a negative drop of 5.6% over the year. But actually, if we look at some of the other stats, there's some more positive trends there. So in terms of the volume of wines traded, we're actually up 13.3%. So in 2024, we had 8,737, and this year we're just shy of 10,000. Which I think is interesting, right? And then if we look at kind of unique wines traded, that was up just a nudge at 2,524, up from 2,496. And finally, just how many transactions did we record in our database, our transactional database? Now, to give you a bit of context at home, our data science and data engineering teams have a number of different ways of ingesting data. So we ingest data from public platforms, public exchanges. We also ingest our own data on our own platform, Coltex, which is a marketplace and trading platform. We also ingest our own data from our B2B side of the business. And all of these sources of information are effectively used to create this database. So if we look at the total amount of transactions recorded, and we use the same source in both 24 and 25, we actually saw trades increase by 2,500. So this year we had 36,500 trades registered, which was up 7.2%. I think from my perspective, whilst we've seen the price overall in 25 come down 5.6%, which I think is in line with the overall market. I think the LiveX indices, I'm not sure what the exact finishing number was in terms of the LiveX 100. You might know better than I do for 2025. But certainly the broader kind of market indices that are well reported have obviously suggested that prices were down in 25 overall from the start to the finish. But look, I mean, question for you, Joe. I think that any type of market, any type of asset class, you want to be seeing an increase in activity, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I think the issue over the last few years is that the liquidity has come away from the market. That has been the number one problem that the wine market has faced. It's not a market that is, flush with buyers in the best of time. When the wine market is operating at its full capacity, that means that there's sufficient liquidity for the supply on the market to be taken off over time for prices to increase in value. That's how the wine market works. So, unfortunately, when you have a scenario where that liquidity, that number of people participating in the market is impacted, we have a scenario that we have for the last few years. Now, the one of the reasons why the last few years has been difficult is because really both sides of the coin have been impacted. Collectors who are less wedded to what's necessarily happening in the macro environment. They're buying the wines because they want to buy the wines. They enjoy the wines. They're less kind of data driven almost. It's much more objective buying. They've been impacted because, things that you spend money on that you don't need around the world have been impacted over the last few years. Luxury goods has represented the same thing. Interest rates going up, other asset classes performing well have impacted those buyers that are more motivated by the investment side of the wine market. So we've had a scenario where both sides of those coins have been impacted. So we've had, oversupply in the market and prices have fallen. So the fact that now in 2025, even though prices have fallen, but we've seen larger participation, I think is really encouraging. And that's the early indicator. We're now seeing the results of that coming through, because in Q4, as we'll come on to, prices starting to rise. And that's because in the first part of the year, more people are in the market buying wine. More people are taking the case off the bottom of the market, allowing prices to increase. So I think that's what's been reflected in this data. So yeah, look, we know that prices fell last year, but a really encouraging sign that buyers are coming back in. They were seeing that as the time to come in and start taking wines off the market, thinking that is the price to start buying at.
Yeah, obviously we'll come on to it. And I think one of the things when we were looking at the data we wanted to capture is, like, if you do look at it, it's a very kind of singular 12-month yardstick. Yeah, generally we're going to see on average prices have obviously come down, but I don't think that really captures the true picture that we try to articulate, which is certainly a pickup in interest and pickup in demand, and certainly a pickup in pricing over the last sort of 3 to 4 months. That's why we have looked at sort of the momentum shift from start to the end of the year and the last couple of quarters. But if we do just look at a regional breakdown, in terms of the performance, so as I said, overall minus 5.6%. So the worst performing sub-region, if we look at all the wines from that region that are in our database and look at the average price change in 25 versus 24, is Bordeaux, minus 6.85%. Any surprise there?
Not for me. I think, it's the region with the most supply, the most estates that produce wines of investment grade quality.
Yeah.
It is the most kind of liquid region, if you like.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think it suffered probably the most with the fact that there's an oversupply in the market. There's just a lot of Bordeaux around, which I guess we'll come on to when we get a bit more granular. And I think that's one of the main reasons why it suffered the most.
Yeah. Rhone Valley was next at minus 6.8%. After that is the darling of the fine wine world, Burgundy, at minus 5.7%. Italy, minus 5.2%. USA, minus 4.9%. Champagne, minus 4%. And then effectively, the best performing region in 2025 was the rest of the world at minus 2.3%. Is that kind of aligned with what you saw in the market last year? Was there any surprises there?
No, I think that aligns. I think that there's not a huge difference between any of them. I think it's been, there has really been, I'd say, for the want of a better phrase, nowhere to hide for buyers during this period of time. So to see a kind of fairly uniform set of results in terms of the way that things have declined is logical, because there wasn't the requisite buyers in the market. So all areas have suffered, really. Yeah. I think that the variance is going to be in the recovery, actually, I think. Yeah. To my mind. But yeah, no surprises really.
Well, look, the first segment we're going to look at are the top traded wines in 2025. Okay, so a bit of context for those listening at home. To remove outliers, remove a bit of noise from the data, we only looked at wines that traded at least 3 times in 2024 and 2025. Of which there's 1,535 wines that traded 3 times in both periods. Interestingly, just looking at that segment, only 285 of those wines recorded a higher price in 25 on average than 24, with 1,250 wines trading at a lower price on average. So that kind of gives you a bit of an indication of the overall trend in the market in 2025. But anyway, we kind of looked at the data and just ranked them 1 to 10. In terms of the most traded wines. So Joe, do you want to take us away and go through the list from number 10?
Yeah, sure. There are a couple of wines in here that I think everyone would expect. They're big names. People know they're going to be traded a lot. But there are some interesting themes. So a fair amount of champagne in the whole list, actually. So number 10.
Actually, 4 out of the 10 are champagne.
4 out of 10 are champagne. Look, it's the highest production. The wines are the highest production.
Right.
And they are the consumed in the most volume
Yeah.
globally of fine wines. So
Yeah.
not overly surprising, but still, interesting nonetheless. Number 10 is Tattinger Compt 2008,
Yeah.
123 trades.
Yeah.
Look, I think 2008 champagne is actually a couple in the list. So it's 3 in the list actually. Best ever, widely regarded as the best ever vintage.
Yeah.
Champagne has had, a little bit of a rocky time throughout the period, and that's because it's coming off the back of a huge surge in prices between 2019 and 2022, and there's been a bit of correcting over that period of time. But I think throughout the year, it's been apparent from our side that demand for champagne is still really robust.
Yeah.
I think that historically, champagnes have increased gradually because there's a high supply in the market.
Yeah.
You buy a champagne young, you're really going to have to allow 8 to 10 years, 12 years for that price to really get to a level where it makes it worthwhile to own. And that's because the volume is high. We're talking about the Grand Marque champagnes, Dom Perignon, Cristal, Tassinger, etc. And all the time those wines are being traded. But still, really interesting to see that there's been a lot of trading for these wines, and actually the prices are really starting to sort of solidify and recover. Number 9 is Sassicaia 2018.
Yeah.
126 trades. Look, I think one of the kind of most recognizable names in the market. Blue chip, probably as blue chip as you get.
Yeah.
Really alongside the first growth.
Blue label blue chip.
Liquid, blue label, blue chip. Next is...
It's a surprise. The next one is a surprise for me.
Yeah.
The price point's interesting, right? Sub £400. It is interesting just looking at this list, the top 10. There is 1, 2, 3. There's 4 wines here that trade, less than £50 a bottle, which is interesting in itself. Because I think everyone thinks about the investment collectible part of the market as being, first growth Bordeaux, Grand Cru Burgundy, and that obviously goes without saying. But clearly, when you do look at trading, how many wines trade a lot, volume of trading in a market, liquidity, quite often those wines don't appear on the list because there isn't hundreds and hundreds of cases of Domaine de la Romanée quantity. Plus, at the price point that it trades at, there isn't necessarily that many buyers willing to pay those prices. So, give it away in terms of revealing number 8 on the list.
Chateau d'Isson, 2016.
Yeah, which, looks incredible value. Great vintage for Bordeaux. Chateau d'Isson is something that's had a lot of investment from the Marque Appellation, third growth. Obviously now, a little bit shy of 7-8 years bottle age.
Yep.
Probably drinking pretty well right now.
16s were always going to be drinking does
that reflect the trend of last year's market, like people looking for value, the buyers that were in the market?
Absolutely, and it kind of goes back to my point around people spending less on things they don't need. I think that has been a real theme around the world, and people looking for high quality wine to drink, because it's not like they've lost interest in drinking wine, maybe just pulling the purse strings a little bit. And something like an Isson 2016 fits the bill, because and there's another one that really stands out on that list that actually I think fits that category, which was surprising. So we'll get to number 5. The next 2 are pretty obvious. They're leading names in Bordeaux. Ponte Canet 2019, 133 trades, average price of 565 per 12, which looks to me...
Is that the controversial one?
No, not yet.
No, the Ponte Canet...
No. You think it's controversial?
Isn't it the one that Neil Martin said tasted like a...
Oh, he's tasting those.
No, William Kelly.
Was it 2020?
Maybe it was 2020. Yeah, okay, fine.
And so look, but I think 2019 Bordeaux, which is exceptional. I think if the Ponte Canet 2019 was, if those that remember were involved in the En Primeur campaign at the time, was the early release that year, really set the tone for a great En Primeur campaign, really high quality, and has subsequently come down in price a lot during this kind of market
how you were
correction.
talking about like the 08 for champagne. I think of like 19 being the equivalent of the 08 for Bordeaux.
I agree.
In terms of like really high quality, everything looks really good value,
Yep.
kind of ready to start drinking now. Obviously there's tons of it on the market, so you see it trading quite a lot. But actually generally looking at quality, age, price point, there isn't... How many 2019s do you look at and ever think, oh, that's overpriced?
Yeah.
You just don't, right? In terms of the scores it's got and the quality of vintage overall.
I agree.
You feel like inevitably that has to start ticking back in the right direction, right?
Absolutely. I think the 19s. You can actually say the same thing for Burgundy as well in terms of quality for both regions. Absolutely exceptional. And then we've got Mouton 16. These are the names that you'd expect to see on this list. The first grows from top vintages, from more recent top vintages, are the names that you would expect to see on this list. So it is an interesting theme here that the most traded wines this year have been at the lower end of the price per bottle. And then the next one, number 5 on the list, is the one that really surprises me, and that's Senya 2018. So the most
expensive on the list is what, the Mouton, right?
Mouton,
yeah. Go on, Senya.
Senya 2018.
Yeah.
149 trades. But I think we've highlighted this wine before. I think Arash highlighted it.
It's come down in value quite a lot though, right?
Yeah. But that's interesting because it's not necessarily a really liquid wine. It's traded a lot. The top wines from Chile are historically wines that have been actively traded. Senya, not necessarily as much as Almaviva. But I think it very much is related to the price and quality and people looking for good wines to drink and available at a cheaper price. I think it's 100 points on 98, 99. It's that very upper end. It's one of the best Senya vintages.
I don't want to digress on the Ponce Canet thing, but I was right. It's the 19. So right. James Suckling gave it 99 points. Lisa Perotti Brown gave it 99 points. William Kelly gave it 93. And he said, tasted twice. It's a wine I find somewhat perplexing. In a blind tasting, I might be more inclined to place it in Gigondas than Pauillac. I'm far more dogmatic when it comes to what French call typicity, and stylistic diversity surely enriches every appellation. But by the same token, I'm not convinced that this is the most compelling aesthetic that a Cabernet-based blend from this part of Bordeaux can realise.
Wow, scathing.
I think that's when it got banned after that. But to be fair, Neil Martin tasted at the Southwold tasting, the famous blind tasting. So he did taste it blind, and he said grainy tannins, mulberry and game, almost Syrah-like in style.
Interesting.
So there's a little bit of synergy there between the two of them. But anyway, sorry, I digress.
Another vintage of Taittinger. Oh, sorry. Next is Cristal 2008. Similar story with the Taittinger 2008, but Cristal, again, one of the most traded wines in the market.
It's crazy how much that wine trades.
Yes.
There's always a bid in the market for that wine.
Yeah, there's always someone looking to pop a few bottles. And then Rioja Alta 2011. Again, really good value, really high volume, traded a lot. And then finally, top spot, Dom Perignon 2008. Little surprise, given the volume that's on the market and the reputable nature of the brand.
What do you reckon the production is for Dom Perignon?
In a good year, I think they make 5 million bottles.
It's a lot, isn't it?
That's a lot of wine.
Does any other wine come close?
So Lafite will make, being quite a high production Bordeaux, will make about 150,000 bottles.
Yeah, so it's kind of like
200,000 bottles. So, I mean, that gives you the scale of how much champagne is released onto the market and the volume at which, the volume at which it's consumed. And that's why you have to allow for a long period of time for these wines to develop, and why that period between 19 and 2022 was so unusual in the spike in pricing.
And I think the other thing with Dom Perignon is obviously just like, pretty much since 2000, they've released a vintage every year as well. So there's just like so much stock of it as well. But trades a lot, and that was our number one traded wine for 2025. So well done, Dom Perignon. Bravo indeed.
Chapeau.
Right, top performing wines in 2025, not by trading value, but by price performance. So for this particular list, we've based it on a minimum of 3 trades in each period. These wines have recorded the largest average price increase year on year. So we looked at minimum 3 trades. What was the average price that wine traded at in 2024? Looked at the trades in 25. What was the average price it traded for in 25? Simple maths. What was the percentage difference between the two? We're not going to go through the full list because we've got a list of 20 on here. As I said, everything we're talking about here is going to be released in a report online. So make sure you follow the right path to download that. I don't know exactly where it'll be right this second, but it will be signposted as part of this part of this podcast. So the top performing wines of 2025, minimum of 3 trades in each period. This is very simple. Which wines have gone up the most in value? There's 20 here. Maybe let's just pick out some interesting ones. Should we start with the top 3 at least? Because I feel like they should be given gold, silver, bronze.
Yep. So look, coming in with the bronze medal is Jean Fayard Morgon from Beaujolais, 2020 vintage. So originally traded in 2024 at 282 and has jumped to 369 in 2025. And that's across 3 trades in 2025. So I wouldn't say it's the most robust data, but interesting theme nonetheless. And it cropped up on a few other lists as well. Again, good value, great conduit. If you enjoy drinking Pinot Noir, then, hopping on down to Beaujolais is not necessarily completely out of the realm.
This producer's obviously become a bit of a darling in the kind of natural wine movement.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most recognizable names in kind of Beaujolais. And yeah, I think if you're looking, because if you think about recent years, especially outside of the obvious regions, it has been places like Jura and maybe somewhere like a Beaujolais or maybe other areas like that, a little bit more esoteric, where you could see some really big gains in terms of price performance. Now, obviously, 370 from 280 is not a huge amount in terms of just nominal value, but obviously a 31% increase in value kind of tends to suggest there's increasing demand and attention for this type of wine. Second place, I think, is this a wine that holds a close place in your heart? Are you a fan of this wine?
I do like this wine. Yeah, it's a superb wine.
Yeah.
Probably one of the best white wines you can buy, I think.
Yeah.
So Chateau Gruyère from the Rhone Valley, owned by Artemis, who also own Latour. And
has it got its own appellation designation, right?
Yeah, like that? That's right. Yeah. So I think it's interesting because it's kind of such a premium white wine, and it hasn't really done a lot for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting to see it on this list. It might be the moment that actually, and maybe some of the things we'll come on to later on with this development and more interest in white wine in the key regions around the world for wine demand, particularly Asia. White Burgundy's had a really, really good period. Probably been one of the most robust areas from the whole market. And lo and behold, one of the most premium white wines you can find outside of Burgundy has performed really well and is showing high on this list.
I'm a big fan of Viognier anyway, but this is very much the pinnacle of Viognier, and I've been fortunate to taste a few vintages of this wine. It's an absolutely incredible wine, a real iconic name. As you said, it's interesting because I think the last couple of years where we have seen a bit more of a suppressed market, and that suppressed market comes generally from the most well-known names, the most traded names, obviously falling in value. It has maybe given a bit of airtime and a little bit of space for some of these names to kind of crop up. And, if you think about when the wine market went through that huge expanse for like 10, 15 years, one name for me was always kind of a bit of a laggard, which was Chateau d'Yquem. And maybe we'll come into a little bit later. But, in the last couple of years, Chateau d'Yquem suddenly now it's almost kind of counter-cyclical. It's actually performed quite well in this period of time. And maybe it's because everything else is not performing that great. It kind of really stands out and starts to shine a little bit. But the other argument is, the wines that didn't get affected so much by the speculative bubble that occurred in kind of 21 and 22 as a result of the pandemic and those market conditions, have had the time to breathe and the time to space to kind of come out at the top of these lists.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's very pleasing to see it there, actually. It's a wine that deserves more praise, I think.
Absolutely. Number one wine of the year in terms of price performance. Only 3 trades in 24 and 3 trades in 25. So we have to make that point that we are looking at relatively small data set in this scenario. 24, it's traded on average price of £917 per case. 25, it's traded up at 1,350. So a gain of more than 47%. Which is quite incredible in just 1 year. And it is Michel Chapoutier's Hermitage Le Pavillon, which again is an iconic wine, one of the top wine producers from the Rhone Valley, an incredible cuvee. And 2008 vintage, not necessarily remarkable from a perspective of maybe a critic's score or vintage quality, but maybe just suggests or says something more around sort of those wines now that are getting into that maturity phase where, people are happy to pay a bit more of a premium to access, bottles that are ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that even though there's only 3 trades for the 2008, I think that if you look at the trades across the more recent vintages, this is a wine that's actually quite liquid and traded quite actively across the board. And maybe that's a reflection that a 2008 coming into its drinking window.
Yeah.
I think if you went onto the market now and looked for cases, there's probably very few listed compared to some of the more recent vintage releases, 16, 17, etc.
Absolutely. There's 3 more names on this list I'd like to bring up and just get your view on. And I think they kind of just stand out a little bit to me. So the three wines are Il Marinetto, Brunello Montalcino 2016. The other one is Ozone 2010.
Yep.
And finally, I think really we talked about this before the pod, but the kind of star of the show for 2025 was Calm's Haut-Brion 22. Are you surprised to see those names in the top of this list?
I'm surprised to see Ozone 2010 in there.
Yeah.
Not because it's a premium iconic vintage from Bordeaux, but just Ozone never features on these lists.
Yeah, but that's the weird thing. It's kind of like all the names like Akem or Ozone and these sort of like Grille that don't normally, in our last 15 years of working in this industry, don't normally see them in these lists, but suddenly they're appearing. It's interesting.
You know, having lived in Hong Kong for 10 years and worked in that market where, you know, probably the largest market in the world where they drink the most premium wines and a lot of aged Bordeaux, Ozone is that premium iconic estate that you see the least.
It's interesting you say that because I feel like I have drunk Ozone quite a lot in Asia. Maybe back in the day.
Yeah, before my time maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's one I never come across. I never meet anyone that's really into Ozone. But
I think like maybe some more of those kind of traditional old school Hong Kong buyers very much driven by the kind of first growth Bordeaux classified growth. I think they see kind of Ozone, Cheval Blanc. They kind of not necessarily dismiss Angelus and Pavie, but that whole kind of reclassification in 22, I think they give an extra bit of prestige to Ozone because Ozone and Cheval Blanc are seen as kind of the original first growths on the right bank, you know, alongside Petrus Le Pan.
Yeah,
is it not included in the Duclos case?
It's included, yeah. It's included.
I feel like it's still got a little bit of that cachet.
Yeah.
But anyway, go on.
Yeah. So that surprises me. I mean, that jumped by 20% across 6 trades, so pretty decent sample size there. Look, Calm Haut-Brion, as you mentioned, is the star of the show, I think, for this year. This is the one where you really see a marked increase in a challenging year. Even in the first half of 2025, you could see that wine really, really surging in price.
Yeah.
6 trades in 2024, 54 trades in 2025, increase in price of 19.1%. And that's related to an in-bottle tasting, right?
Right.
That wine was given 100 points when it was put into the bottle.
Yeah.
That's just a bit of an old school, bit of a throwback in the market. You know, that hasn't happened for quite some time. In the halcyon days of Robert Parker tasting wines and moving the market overnight.
Who gave it 100 points? Everyone? I think you got quite a few, did it?
I think the head critic, who's not William Kelly at Robert Parker, his name escapes me, he's new.
Johan Castaigne.
That's it.
100 points. Georgina Hindle from Decanter.com, 100 points. James Suckley, 99. Jeb Dunnock, 100. Neil Martin, 96. Lisa Protti Brown, 99.
Yeah, solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? So it's interesting that even in the Wine Advocate, Johan Castaigne, which is obviously a pretty new name on the block, can still move the market that much.
That hasn't happened for a long time. That hasn't happened for a long time.
Well, William Kelly can do it still, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not in Bordeaux, but certainly you've seen it in Champagne and Burgundy. If he gives 100 points, the prices go crazy.
Yeah. That's true.
Think like Cecil Tremblay, Chapelle Chambertin 2019, he gave 100 points. Wine like doubled in price. Aigle-Aurier, Ulysses Collin, he's given 100 points to the
This
price
is just a bit more
Mental.
accessible, isn't it? Because
No, for sure.
It's just
it's just interesting to see the Wine Advocates still carry that sort of weight.
Yeah.
In a way, I probably should have done a bit more research, but I was expecting to see Neil Martin's name there. Because I kind of expect Neil Martin giving 100 points to Calm Haut-Brion 22 to be able to have that impact on the price.
Maybe it's just also a reflection of the fact that 22 is such an exceptional vintage as well. But yeah, really interesting.
Any comments on Il Marinetto?
Well, I think it's a wine that's shown up on a few lists here. The Madonna della Grazie, which is their top cuvee, has also performed really well in 2025.
And that dovetails nicely into the top 20 velocity wines because number one on the velocity list, which looks at wines that have traded at least 5 times in both 24 and 25. So we start to narrow down the data set here. Il Marinetto is the one at the very top of the list. So there is a substantial amount of trades to look at here. We can kind of ignore any potential noise or outlier impacts, and it's coming at 27.3% growth in value.
I couldn't discern any particular reason why that wine has suddenly become so in focus.
Yeah.
You know, usually you hear a bit of something, it's been in the news, or someone who's tasted it and made some comments around it. Look, it's a great wine. I think it's a wine that does crop up quite a lot in Asia for sure.
Yeah, does it?
It does. I think they came over and did a tasting at one of the
2016 is a
clubs.
great vintage for Brunello, right?
Yep.
So clearly high quality vintage again. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens this year then. I think with vintages it's gone up a huge amount this year.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the graph on Colt X and you can just see how much the trades have increased there. From the start of that period there, coming in at kind of like 330 per 6. I mean, the last trade of the year was at 565 per 6. 565 per 6, and the first trade of the year was at what, 330? I mean, that's an amazing increase, but it's actually congregated around quite a few different 96 points. But as you said,
there's nothing particularly exceptional about it, really. I mean, aside from the fact that Marinetto, the style, maybe is something that has resonated with a lot of wine buyers and wine collectors around the world.
I mean, the only other thing you say about Marinetto is it just has a lot of good critic scores. So I think that kind of consensus. I don't want to go off on a segue here, but I do think consensus-driven tasting notes or tasting scores these days is actually quite important to consumers. I think it's noticeable when you see, oh, hang on a second, that's got a high score from someone, or maybe not a high score from someone else. When you go, oh my god, like all of the big names have given that a really good score. I think that's when that does pick up consumers' attention. So maybe that's what's been driving the Il Marinetto performance. Looking at some of the other names on this list, it's interesting to see some white wine on here. And we talked in one of the other podcasts a lot about white Burgundy, and I think that's going to be another theme for 2026 and into the future, because white Burgundy, I think, continues to go from strength to strength. Joseph Duran's Chassagne Montrachet Premier Cru Morgeau Marquis de la Guiche, which is kind of the baby brother to the Montrachet de la Guiche. That's come in here at a 14.4% change in value for the 2020 on average. What do you think about white Burgundy? Were you surprised not to see more white Burgundy names in this list so far? And what do you think particularly around sort of that producer and that vintage? And
look, I think white Burgundy has certainly probably been one of the real bright spots for the whole market over the last 2 or 3 years. And maybe the fact that we're not seeing a huge amount in there is because actually a lot of the hard work, a lot of the groundwork for those wines was done in 2024. So they're not necessarily you're not seeing the delta here in the 25 data. But look, I think had we done this list for last year, I think Montrachet Marquis de la Guiche would have been number one or close to it. So the fact that the Chassagne, the Premier Cru version, which is exceptional, by the way, is showing on here, I think ties in quite nicely with some of the themes we're seeing. People looking for value, people looking for more affordable options for the wines that they love. And I think that the Marquis de la Guiche Montrachet is maybe not necessarily now, but it's still up there in terms of the best value kind of, if you can have value next to the word Montrachet Grand Cru, but certainly Grand Cru level white and Burgundy, that's one of the wines that you get the best sort of bang for your buck, in my opinion. So the fact that the Premier Cru is on here, I think, is interesting because I think that it's a strong value wine, and probably gives you some of the same character and style of the main wine, of the main cuvee.
I know this is not actually going to be in the top list, but I think when we looked at this data, it's over 1,000 wines and kind of looked at sort of number of trades and price change. And I think one statistic for me that stood out is actually looking at all of the wines that did at least 100 trades. Now, every single one that did more than 100 trades, on average, declined in value in 2025. And I think that kind of talks to some of the things we were talking about earlier, where more liquidity, more supply with the wines that have the more volume on the market, obviously getting traded down. But I think that'll be an interesting thing to see next year. If we are seeing the market pick up a little bit, if we are starting to see people replenish cellars, if we are starting to see buyers come back to the market, do we sense a shift going to happen for the more traded wines? And obviously we'll come into that when we look at our outlook. But that could be something for people to look at this year, looking at like the top most traded wines and thinking, after 1, 2, maybe even 3 years of a lot of these highly traded wines, all seeing year after year decline in prices, is 26 going to be the year where we start to see that reverse? It feels like statistically that would be the case. So that was just an interesting thing that stood out to me, because it does feel like that could be where the safe money is in 2026 if people are looking to find value. We've also created what we call the market movers list. So I think for us, what we wanted to do is also slice and dice the data where we could look at maybe sort of higher value wines. So we kind of restricted and shrunk down the universe to look at wines that had a certain amount of traded value in the year and looking at the price change. So we combined both price change and an increase in the traded value, not necessarily the number of trades. And yeah, it flung out some really interesting examples, and I think this is something that I think gives encouragement. I think going into next year, especially in some of the more rarer, higher value items that have started maybe to suggest that they're kind of either finding a little bit of a plateau or starting to pick up again. I'll just kick off with one name, which is the number one on this list, and that's Mouton Rothschild 1982. So coming around to its 44th birthday in 2026.
Life in the old dog, yeah.
Life in the old dog, yeah. I mean, just to put it into context, I think last year it was trading around the £10,000 or maybe sub £10,000 per case level. And I actually remember looking at this because we actually had some inquiries ourselves for this particular wine. And it was amazing how quickly the price moved for this. We had a couple of inquiries from the UAE for Mouton 82. And I remember in the market, there was a couple of cases in Europe, a couple of cases in the UK, like kind of £10,500, £11,000. All of a sudden, once the deal got confirmed, like all that supply just vanished. And suddenly it was up at 13,500, 14,000. The reason I mention that is I think that is what can happen with the really mature kind of iconic vintages of wine. And I know a lot of people, when it comes to investing in wine, will always focus on the younger vintages, one, because of accessibility, two, because of longevity, and three, normally you buy younger vintages, you get them at a good price. But in a buoyant market where things are moving in the right direction, you know, you're just not going to find a huge amount of perfect OWC, provenance, condition, authentic cases of Mouton 82 in the market. Now, if you genuinely do have 2 or 3, 4 buyers, and you don't need a lot of actual buyers, suddenly the price can move quite quickly. And I think that's kind of what we've seen here in the 82, which is, you know, a mature, expensive vintage of Mouton, you know, close to over £1,000 per bottle. Finding a market, having buyers looking for that provenance, looking for that pristine conditioning, and willing to pay a price to it because they're probably pretty price inelastic. So yeah, interesting just to see that at the top of the list.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a reflection of the fact that buyers out there are prepared to pay for the right condition of wines, particularly at that age as well, right? Because you're spending a lot of money on a case of wine. You are rolling the dice a little bit, so to be really sure that it's been stored properly, that it's in perfect condition, you should be happy to pay a premium for that as well. Yeah, really interesting. I think that, you know, it just goes to show how aged wines can be really resilient. Even in difficult periods, because there's fewer cases listed. There's a shallower depth of stock, and there's less stock that's able to come onto the market and keep prices suppressed. So even if demand is low, you know, you're kind of in a pretty safe position with older wines.
Do you think that's a trend that you would advise around for 2026, or do you think that's a trend that could continue into 26? Because actually, if you think about it, like, I mean, without looking at the data straight away, but stuff like Hope We're on 89. You think about that first growth, that stature. Obviously, the price got pretty crazy for that wine. I would guess that's come down quite a lot in the last couple of years. But I don't know, I just feel like you start thinking of like those iconic vintages, like a Palmer 83, obviously Lafite and Mouton 82.
Yeah,
you know,
I think
those
it's
iconic vintages of some of those wines. You can start thinking, well, actually, could it be a good time to get back in where maybe the prices have come off 20, 30, 40% from where their peak was?
Yeah, I think it is a balance, because I think that they are well priced. And actually, if you look at the market with some of those wines, they haven't really come down so much. But maybe that doesn't really reflect the true picture, just because there's a lack of availability on the market. What are the next group of wines up, age-wise, from those iconic vintages? The wines
90s, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
The best wines from the 90s, I think. You know, if you're looking at 82 Mouton, 89 Haut Briand, maybe the 89s or 89 Haut Briand's a bit of an outlier because it's such an iconic wine. But I'm looking at Latour and Margaux 96 as probably the two greatest, certainly left bank Bordeaux wines that were made in Bordeaux in the 90s.
Yeah.
And having been lucky enough to have them recently, they're the two best experiences with Bordeaux I've had for a very, very long time. They are in the groove now. So how long do they have left? Well, at that level, 10, 15, 20 years.
Well, can I just say to that point, just looking at this list, the name that is 17th in the list, I guess, or 18th, is Haut Briand 2000, which was 55% up in 25 versus 24 in terms of the value that was traded, and the price increased by 7%. So that kind of fits in with that thesis that you have there.
Yeah. And, up 7% against a backdrop of Bordeaux falling by 7%.
Yeah.
So you really have to take that into consideration when you look at these figures. I think that's pretty interesting.
Can we talk about Burgundy?
Always.
Any Burgundy names on that list that jump out at you?
Look, it's good to see Rousseau back on the list.
Yeah. I mean, that was one I was thinking. You fell into my trap.
Yeah. Probably one of the wines that suffered the most during the correction. That's because, actually, I remember, sorry to digress slightly, but we did a report of the top performing wines of the decade, and Rousseau Chambertin was number one.
That was a while ago, right?
That was in 22. So maybe towards the peak of the market.
Mm.
So if you think that at the peak of the market, Rousseau Chambertin was the best performing wine of anything over the last decade.
But then when we did the top wines of 2023, 2 years ago, the two worst performing wines in the top 100 were Rousseau, Chambertin, and Chateau Reyes, which we'll come on to.
Yeah.
So to your point, it's interesting to see a little bit of that bounce back.
Yeah. So look, probably grew too much and have corrected during that period of time. So I think a lot of Burgundy junkies out there will be really pleased to see Rousseau on this list. And, in a big way, I think the most interesting figure is the fact that the 2018 has increased in trade value in 2025 by 137%. That's really interesting to me. Because, it comes back to a point we were raising before. Buyers are coming back in, they're seeing value. Look, it's risen by 18%, which in the context of where Rousseau has been over the last few years isn't necessarily groundbreaking, although that's obviously very good. It is really encouraging to see, what looks like buyers come back in quite a serious way there.
Yeah, because I think when we saw the prices for like Chambertin Rousseau, especially like for a vintage like 18, get into that kind of like €2,000 a bottle level, which is kind of roughly £1,500 a bottle. Mm-hmm. I think we were looking at each other going like, how much lower can it go?
Yeah,
it's got to have some support at this stage, and I think that's what we've seen a little bit of that rebound where it's picked back up from that kind of £1,500 level, going back up towards that sort of £2,000 per bottle, which is interesting. I mean, just looking at a couple of other names on this list. Obviously, we talked about Champagne earlier, but in this particular list, we're looking at some of the more expensive, older vintages. So P2, I know for a fact, across most of the P2 vintages has done really well. The 98s come in here 150% up in terms of traded value, and the price is appreciated by 15%. Soldera is in there, which I think has weathered the storm in terms of the market performance. I think actually, if you look at,
it's probably been the best performing one.
Yeah, well, probably. I mean, alongside probably like Tianello, which is a different story. But I think Soldera, in terms of the top end of the market, has done incredibly well despite everything around it kind of crumbling to a certain extent. Salon as well, 1997. We'll come on to that a little bit in terms of more recent vintages. And you did touch on Salon 02. We asked. That was kind of a bit of a darling of the investment market. Obviously, the price went up, skyrocketed, went crazy during the pandemic, came off a lot. And, we started to see demand and trading and interest in Salon start picking up again. So, yeah, there's some really encouraging signs just by looking at the names and the vintages on this list.
Absolutely. Interesting about, I'm just going to pick out another one, Aiguille-Urier Millésime 2013.
Yep.
Because, again, I think over the last kind of 2.5 years, alongside Soldera, I'd probably say Aiguille-Urier, Montrachet Marquis Laguiche, and Soldera, without going into too much of the detail on the data, off the top of my head, I feel like those three wines have been they've kind of bucked the trend somewhat versus the market. So the fact that the 2013 vintage is on this list in 2025, having performed very well in 2024, I think is really interesting, and just goes to show how popular that wine is, how well regarded that wine is, and justifiably so. It's an exceptional wine, one of the best champagnes that is produced, without question, the Millésime from Aiguille-Urier.
So, I mean, how many different ways can we slice and dice the data, you ask? And we've got many more ways.
It's a 3.5-hour podcast.
Knives at the ready. Right. How are we chopping up this one? We are looking at wines that have traded a minimum of 5 times, and we look at the first traded year versus the last traded year and ranking them from the highest appreciation downwards. So in front of us, we've obviously reduced this list down to a digestible 20 wines. I mean, there's some interesting names on here for sure. I mean, one name here that's in second place is going to be a real surprise for a lot of people. It's not a real surprise to me because I absolutely adore this wine. It's actually the Pinot Noir, but it's normally the Chardonnay. I was known for a while to do blind tastings of Grand Cru Burgundy and Premier Cru Burgundy to audiences where I would hide this Chardonnay in there and I could guarantee almost every time people would be absolutely astounded that A, it wasn't from Burgundy, and B, it would often come out first or second favourite. And this is a wine from New Zealand under screw cap, which is called Bell Hill. The Chardonnay is phenomenal, but actually it's the Pinot Noir that comes out in this list. It traded 12 times in...
Were they all you?
Yeah, they were all me. I've sabotaged this.
Yeah, you've moved the market.
It traded 12 times in 2025, and the first trade of the year came in at around £1,000 per case, and the last trade of the year came in at 1,900. So if you look at the difference between the last trade and the first trade of the year, it was an 88% increase over those 12 trades throughout the year. Which is quite remarkable, and it's always refreshing and nice to see a new name. And like, you know, the names on this list, you know, we've got Il Marinetto, we've got Sassicaia, we've got Louis Latour, Corton Charlemagne, Ornelas, Dom Perignon, Reyes, Rousseau, Sassicaia, Biondi Santi, Unico from Ribera del Duero, Lafite, Leflèvre, Chevalier, and Montrachet. So the company it's keeping is right out of the top drawer.
Yeah. It's really interesting because it's not a cheap wine.
No, it's not, for sure.
It's a premium. This is a Premier Cru Burgundy price.
Yeah.
For a wine from New Zealand.
Yeah.
And if you actually look at the trades, you know, it's a genuinely, this price has been bid up to this level throughout the year.
Yeah, for sure.
And people have looked at the price at 1,700 and thought, I still like that. I want to buy more. And they've continued to buy, which I think is really interesting. I've not tried it. I've not been at one of your blind tastings when you've showed
Have
the
you not
Chardonnay.
tried it? Well, I think we've had it before, the Chardonnay. Not
Yeah, no, I've not tried it. So, yeah, looking forward to it, actually.
Yeah, a really interesting project. It was the vineyards were planted in an old limestone quarry. So yeah, definitely a name to look out for. And if you haven't heard about it before, then do have a look online and check that wine out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what? It kind of fits in with a thesis I've had for a while, which is, you know, with Burgundy, you know, being so popular and obviously prices increasing, you kind of always have this feeling that for Pinot Noir lovers, and to a certain degree Chardonnay lovers, where do you go outside of Burgundy if you want to get your Pinot Noir Chardonnay fix? And I've always thought that's quite a good thesis for trying to identify maybe more of the under the radar opportunities for investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen that with other regions.
Yeah.
We've seen that with Jura. We've seen that with actually some wines from Italy that have a kind of Burgundian style.
Any you can think off the top of your head?
I think all the Burgundy nuts that I know love Soldera for that style, because it is quite similar in style.
Yeah. Finesse, aromatics.
Stella de Campalto.
Yeah.
Is a producer that she clearly loves Burgundy. She's clear, you know, I haven't met her personally, but those wines are quite Burgundian in style.
Yeah.
And bit of a cult producer, very difficult to get hold of, but they're wines that I would say that people that love Burgundy trying to gravitate towards. Yeah. I'd also say it was on the previous list, but Emidio Pepe, the Abruzzo, his certainly the red wines have that kind of light, slightly Burgundian style. Not the same, but there's a lot of similar characteristics there that people gravitate towards. And then finally, you know, strictly speaking about Pinot Noir, some areas that I think that haven't necessarily kind of popped investment wise. Yeah. But I think the best conduit to old world Pinot from France, from Burgundy, are Spat Burgunders. I think that the top Spat Burgunders produce wines that are most similar in style to look, they're never going to be like the top wines from Burgundy, but I think if you're looking for...
I had an amazing one the other day.
I mean, Fritz Becker's wines are
the one I had the other day is Daniel Twardowski, Spat Burgunder, and it's called Pinot Noir, but the Noir spelled Noix. It's been on my radar for a while. I was in a restaurant, I saw it on the list, I snapped it up straight away. It's actually quite a good price in a restaurant, about £100 a bottle in London, which is actually pretty good. Amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
Amazing.
Case in point.
Yeah, definitely worth seeking out for anyone listening that's a Pinot Noir lover. Check that out, Pinot Noir, Noix. That's not on this list, but certainly I think it plays into that thing.
And I also think the Pinots from, if we're looking at sort of Australia and New Zealand, having not had Bell Hill, but some of the producers in Tasmania are producing wines that...
Yeah, see, this keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Keeps coming up. I haven't tried
challenging to find.
Have you tried a few?
Yeah, some of the names escape me. I've got a couple of clients who are really into them. They do get a bit in Hong Kong, but they're difficult to find. They're low production. They keep them in Australia.
Yeah, I've heard
you have to find specialist importers. Maybe, you know, they keep coming up, so maybe it's something for a project for us to work on this year, try and get some for people to try. Yeah, because I think they are very similar in style. A lot of the wines that I've tried, old world style, Pinot.
Yeah.
Great. It's cold. It's a cold weather growing conditions essentially.
All right. Well, look, let's get back to this list. And then I just want to pick out a couple of names. One that we've mentioned briefly, but I think worth looking at, which is Chateau Reyes.
Yes.
Bit of background on this because it's traded 5 times. It's the 2012 vintage. First traded year was at 7,100. The last traded year was up at 9,000. So an increase of 25% from the beginning to the end of the year. Any reason for that?
I think I'll probably have to start this conversation by, this is probably my desert island wine, I think, Chateau Reyes. The most singular,
Not
unique
Caymus,
wine.
then.
That's more of an everyday. So I think it's the most singular wine that you can find compared to the region. Grenache. I mean, in Chateauneuf de Pape, you won't try another wine from Chateauneuf de Pape that tastes like Reyes. What they do there is really unusual. The site they have, the terroir, is very unique. Look, probably one of the most visionary winemakers as well, Emmanuel Reynaud, who was really leading that and shaped the way that Reyes is. He passed away in November. Really sad for winemakers around the world, because this is one of the most popular wines in the world amongst the kind of aficionados around the world.
I mean, he was enigmatic. He was an enigma. He was a special winemaker.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think there's a fine art effect here. There is only a certain amount of these wines produced and made by his hand. He was very much linked to the winemaking style and what Reyes is, and why Reyes is so exceptional. So look, really sad day for wine lovers around the world that he passed away. And the other side of this is that people are now looking to buy the wines off the market that he made. And it just so happens that, as Tom alluded to, the prices for Reyes have been it's been one of the worst performing wines in the market.
Yeah, prices have cooled off quite a lot, right?
Because they increased dramatically throughout the COVID period, essentially.
Yeah.
They went up significantly to levels that I actually think aren't outrageous for Reyes.
No.
If you look at the top prices for top Burgundies, for example, the most expensive wines in the world, Reyes is probably one of the only wines from around the world that I think rivals those wines in terms of cachet, quality, history.
Well, look, we were talking about Rousseau Chambertin, which is kind of like 1.5 to 2K per bottle level for the off vintage, like the cheapest accessible vintage. And you think, well, I don't see a problem in the grand scheme of things of Reyes being priced around the same sort of level as that, because it's in the same sort of cachet.
And it did get to that level.
It did get to that level.
It got to that level and quickly cooled off. And has subsequently cooled off quite significantly. So it's been
kind of with Reyes. I find is you find a lot of loose bottles, but not a lot of.
I think that's by design.
For me, it creates quite a disparity, because if you said to me, go into the market and find 20 vintages of Reyes, I could do single bottles where I might even be able to be picking stuff up at like 500, maybe 550 euros a bottle. But then when you look at the 12 bottle case prices, they could be more like 8-9 grand. Case, more like kind of 700-800. So out of all the wines I can think of, even in Burgundy, I don't think you see as much of a discrepancy between kind of the single loose bottles and the case prices. And I don't know whether that's also impacted by the distribution. Obviously, a lot of Reyes went into restaurants, especially French restaurants. And I don't know whether you see that kind of, if you're a French restaurant and you've got an allocation from Emmanuel Reynaud at probably 150 euros a bottle, you're probably more inclined to sell those loose bottles back into the market to clear stock and generate capital at 300-400 euros, and that generates a price versus maybe the OCC level. So I just think the structure of that market's maybe what's impacted it a little bit in terms of hasn't given it that degree of protection that maybe original case Burgundy Grand Crus get.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're starting to see those wines start to really tick up in value now and start to recover properly. So I guess, look, there's a lot of people that own Reyes that maybe have bought into that area over the last few years. And I think that it's not great to see valuations come down the way they have, but the quality of the wine, the outlook for those, for the demand for that wine, how much affection there is for it. I think it's going to be a real standout performer in 2026.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it'd be remiss of us not to mention the fact that on this momentum list, the top 20 wines, the highest appreciation from the first trade to the last trade of the year, it'd be remiss of us not to mention there's 2 first growth wines on here, which it's felt for a long time you wouldn't be seeing a first growth name anywhere near a list like this. But Chateau Lafite Rothschild 2014, 52 trades throughout the year. The first trade of the year that we recorded was 3,842, and the last trade of the year per 12 came in at 4,500. So that was an increase of 18% from the beginning to the end of the year, which for me reflects reality. That's kind of what we've seen. I think beginning of the year we were still seeing people willing to take haircuts.
Yes.
In terms of to shift stock, especially in first growth Bordeaux. And I think at the end of the year, we're starting to see it being bid up, especially from wholesale, especially from Asia. First growth Bordeaux was starting to get bid back up and prices have increased. So that kind of reflects where we're at. And you mentioned kind of 90s Bordeaux being maybe the next area of focus for collectors, especially looking at kind of mature vintages now that are drinking. So it's interesting to see the 1998 vintage of Mouton Rothschild on the list. And for a wine of comparable age, almost 30 years now, traded 32 times, which is showing interesting levels of liquidity for a wine of that age. Again, similar sort of price level, started at 3,800, finished year around 4,500. So again, around a 17% increase. Do you expect to see that trend continue into 2026?
Yeah, look, I think first growths have come off in price. They look relatively cheap. Not every vintage, but they do look relatively cheap. They do look like good value. So I think that as that demand starts to come back in, as we see more buyers from Asia in particular come back into the market, we will see first growths increase considerably well, not necessarily considerably, but we'll see a lot of more first growths start to creep up onto the list. So maybe if we did this time next year,
hopefully we do get to do it again, Joe. If you're invited back.
You will see a lot more first growths on this, as I'd imagine, just because we're coming from a lower base, historically speaking, when it comes to first growth levels.
Yeah. Look, I think obviously it's something we've mentioned a lot. At the beginning of this podcast, talking around kind of the end of the year, the last quarter, kind of feeling like a bit of a change in temperature of the market. So the last thing we're ending on in terms of a data look is we kind of looked at wines that traded in Q3 and Q4. Had to have a minimum of 2 trades in each of the 2 quarters, and just looking at the average price and the change in the average price. And the reason for that is we wanted to kind of try and delve into where the momentum was in the market. So I mean, look, there's 10 names on this list. We can just run through them. We've got the Domaine de l'Ombre, Salaya. Salon, I think it's the 2002 vintage. Mouton Rothschild, Haute Brion, Opus 1, Clos de Tar, Angelus, which is an interesting name to see back up there. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, which we just mentioned. And again, another vintage of Domaine de l'Ombre. So two vintages of Clos de l'Ombre on there, which is particularly interesting. But, all of these wines trading multiple times in the 2 quarters and seeing a decent amount of price appreciation. We did talk about Opus 1. So the 2002 vintage traded 10 times in Q3 at 7.8, and in Q4 traded 11 times up and traded an average of 9.2, which is quite a big jump in the space of 3 to 6 months. Actually, a 17% change in value in that time period. And did I mention Clos de Tar's on there as well? So it's interesting to see Clos de Tar, Clos de l'Ombre on there, a couple of vintages. I mean, out of all of the Grand Cru Burgundies, those 2 particular producers, obviously owned by Artemis and LVMH. We know from a distribution side that obviously it gets a lot of attention. We know the volume they produce is a decent amount. So it's interesting to see both those names trading really well towards the end of 25. What can we decipher from this list? What can we decipher from this data?
This is a list of wines I'd expect to see.
Yeah.
And I'll explain why. I think that these are some of the most liquid wines in the market. These are the most popular names, with the exception of a few, of course, that are not listed here. But when you start to, and I think this is why it's such an encouraging list to see like this, because when you start to see demand come back in, you start to see people wanting to come back in and buy wine again, they're going to go for the wines that are the most popular, right? And we're going to start to see those move. So these have always been a bit of a bellwether to the overall kind of temperature to the market. It used to be, 10 years ago, it was the first growths. 10 years ago, it was the 5 first growths. How are they performing? That gives us an idea of where the market is. But this gives you an idea of how the market's broadened and fanned out. It's not completely representative because it's only 10 names, but the fact that we're seeing Domaine de l'Ombre, really, really actively traded Burgundy,
2016 at the number 1.
Absolutely.
Which looks massively undervalued for the quality of the vintage, the critics score, and obviously since LVMH have come in, they've massively increased their on-promo release price. Right. So there's a massive discrepancy now between the 2016 secondary market price.
Yeah.
So for me, I think that's always a gap that was going to close eventually, because I think you can't have the 16 trading at kind of 40% discount to like 20, 21, 22.
Yeah.
The other thing I noticed with this is I'm just looking at the vintages, and it's actually prime vintage, apart from the Lafite Rothschild, which came in with a 21 vintage, which is interesting. 21 vintage, one of the more recent physical vintages on the market. Maybe an indication that that Asia buying market's coming back in. We know that Asia normally like to be quite label driven. They're happy to buy the cheapest vintage. So that probably leans into that trend, and maybe something we'll see continue. But certainly all the other wines like Mouton, we're looking at the 05 vintage. Interestingly, 22 trades of the 05 in the last quarter of the year, average price of 5,200, whereas in Q3 it was trading at 4,600, 11 trades. So the volume of trading doubled for Mouton 2005, and obviously
you could
the
feel
price
that in
increased
the
by
market
12%.
as well. You could feel that. You could feel the trade. In what was so interesting from where we were sitting in the last quarter of the year is, yes, you start seeing the number of trades on platforms increasing. You start to see prices start to tick up. But the inbound inquiries that we take from other wine companies looking to buy wine was almost overnight doubled and tripled in terms of the number of requests that we got through. And a lot of those were for prime Bordeaux, which I think is really interesting, because historically the most liquid area, and actually it was throughout the course of 2025 and 2024, it was interesting to me to see First Growth sitting on our position and actually taking a long time to sell. And maybe that's a reflection of the fact that Asian buyers weren't necessarily at the table, certainly from China. So I think that really encouraging to see those wines get back into the swing of things, because that is really what underpins a lot of the trade of the market. And we're start seeing that move through. One other name I just want to pick out is Opus One, because it's not a wine that will pull up any trees performance-wise. But I think alongside the First Growth in Bordeaux, it's probably the most recognizable name in China. Really, really popular, really successful project. Very high production, kind of 20, 25,000 cases they produce. But still, one that they're able to command a price for their vintage of it's quite significant per bottle. So doesn't really do much, to be honest with you, in terms of performance, but it's one that you can really hang your hat on in terms of liquidity and appreciation around the world. So I think the fact that one is included here as well and has jumped up in price is really encouraging, and I think is a very good gauge of the temperature of overall demand, particularly from Asia.
Not to finish on a negative note, but we did look at some of the laggards from 2025. So, to look at the laggards, we kind of reviewed the volume of trades in 25 versus 24, what had decreased the most, as well as obviously price depreciation. So we combined those two stats together. No surprise to see 6, 7 Bordeaux names in here. Ponte Canet, I think, has always been a wine that trades a huge amount in the market. So, to put it into context, it's gone from trading 927 times to 835, which got it on the list in terms of a decrease in absolute terms, but obviously still one of the most traded wines in the whole market. But the average price change coming down 6.3%. I think off air before we went on a pod, that was something that you kind of had seen and felt in the market.
Yeah. So I think with the whole theme with Bordeaux, there's kind of a general thing going on in the background, which I'm not sure everyone's aware of. And look, I think interest rates being low, Negociants having access to cheaper credit, and Bordeaux estates releasing their wines at high prices over the last 10 years. Overall, there's obviously been exceptions to that. But the Negociants have to take that volume. They have to take those allocations to maintain those future allocations. And that's put a lot of pressure on their businesses. That's the reality. It's the way the market is set up. And I think that with interest rates increasing at the end of 2022, the pressure has been building, because you've had prices falling, access to credit, drying up, becoming more expensive. You look at the stock they're holding and on their balance sheet, and it probably makes more sense to try and dump that stock. And and I think that's why we've seen a lot of Bordeaux on these lists, because there's been a lot of stock coming onto the market over the past couple of years, and as we've been talking about, the demand hasn't necessarily been there. And I think that's why we've seen such high pressure on Bordeaux. That's probably why it's been the worst performing region in 2025 and probably 2024 as well. So I think that it's a reflection of a significant oversupply, and the fact that whether it's as a result of the tariffs, a slowdown in the Chinese economy, there's been fewer buyers in the market to support that oversupply.
Yeah.
The good news is we now saw in the last chart that we're looking at, that's now starting to shift in Q4. It's going to take a bit of time for that supply to be taken off the market, and we've seen that before. End of the previous kind of peak in Bordeaux and when prices fell at the end of 2011, we saw quite a long period where prices were depressed, but that wasn't a reflection of demand. That was a reflection of it took a bit of time for the supply to come off the market.
Yeah, look, I mean, just looking at this list, a couple other things that stand out, which I think is interesting. And we talked about kind of LVMH and, Colombia obviously sort of having a good end to the year, but one of its other stable mates, Joseph Phelps Insignia from Napa Valley, comes up on this list. A big drop in actually volume of wine traded, dropping from 77 trades to 48, so 38% drop, which is actually quite significant in the context of this list. And actually prices coming down 10%. So interesting, because we just talked about Opus One as being actually something that's done pretty well from Napa and still commands a lot of attention in the market. But maybe some of these less popular wines maybe in Europe. I know something like Phelps Insignia is just like an iconic wine in the US domestic market. I think you speak to a lot of US collectors, it's a real darling for sure. But maybe I don't think it's really managed to establish itself that well. If you go to restaurants across UK and Europe and Asia, it's very rare that you see that type of wine, on the list. Yeah. Are you surprised to see it on there? Is that something that kind of aligns with your view?
I'm a bit surprised to see it on here, just because I think there are probably other wines that would jump to my mind that would fall into this category. But look, they tried to they went with distribution through the Place de Bordeaux. I don't think it's had the desired effect so far.
Yeah.
I think reading between the lines, they probably look at Opus One, they're similarly priced wines, and think we can emulate that project. I don't necessarily think it's quite hit that level.
Yeah.
Nothing taken away from the wine in the bottle, because it's very, very good. Actually, I probably prefer to have an Insignia than an Opus One, but we're not talking about that. This is about brand perception and popularity around the world. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me too much to see it on there, I guess, but unusual.
Last one I was to touch on, which is the only reason I mention it is because it feels like we've gone through this whole podcast and barely talked about anything from Barolo or Barbaresco.
Mm-hmm.
It's been kind of missing, I think, from a lot of the table. So in a negative way, Luciano Sandroni's on this list. We've seen quite a big drop off in terms of trading volumes, dropping 31% and 50% across the two main Barolo vintages, and prices coming down kind of 5 to 6%. Where do you see the we haven't talked about it, but where do you see the state? We have talked about Italy, and I think we've seen bounce back for blue chip wines like Sassicaia or Ornellaia. Tianello, it doesn't matter what happens, seems to always do amazingly. And again, we're seeing it in the last quarter of the year, wines that ticking up. And again, we mentioned Bruno Montalcino, and some of the names from that area, which seemingly have had a relatively good year in the context of 2025. What's your current temperature feel for kind of Barolo and Barbaresco at the moment?
It's a region that I think suffers from a couple of things. I think it's quite confusing. I think you need to be successful these days. You need to have your wines become popular in Asia.
Yeah,
that is really important. That's the engine room of the wine market,
right?
And I don't think they've done a good enough job of getting that message across for their wines in that market.
Right.
The names are confusing. It's a little bit like Burgundy because it's single vineyard, lots of different producers, and I think there's an apprehension with buyers to explore that area because the wines are really quite expensive, the top wines, and it's a little bit confusing. So I think that's one thing. I think that they need to age for quite a long time to show the full potential.
Yeah,
and we've seen wines from other regions, whether it's Bordeaux or the Brunellos that we mentioned, that are actually quite approachable in their youth. The last kind of 5 vintages or so, the top vintages, have been really, like one of the signatures, like 2022, 2019, 2016 for Bordeaux, for example. You could drink them really enjoyably now. And the younger Barolos and Barbarescos, in their very early stages, you get the full character of the wine, but then they tend to sleep for 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And I think that, wine buyers are probably looking for a little bit more of a instant gratification when it comes to buying wine these days. So look, but at the same time, I don't want to be too negative because I adore the wines, and I think that's a region that I think has a lot of potential because of you look at Burgundy as an example. There's a lot of similarities there. Single grape, single vineyard, similar style in wines in some cases. There's a really great quote from Angela Gaia, who runs Gaia. She said, Pinot Noir is like French butter and Nebbiolo is like Italian olive oil, which I thought was really nice because they are quite similar, but there is some quite interesting differences between the two. So I think there's potential for that region, but maybe it needs a little bit of work from those guys to try and get the message out there a little bit.
Absolutely. Oh, look, I mean, just to reiterate to those of you that have stayed the course.
Bravo to you.
Well done. Well done, you. Give yourself a pat on the back. The thing I was going to say is this is, of course, a report. We're giving you sort of the top of the information. And, of course, this will be available online. So make sure you go and download and read the rest of the report and get access to all the information there and make your own mind up. But I think just to round it up and finish, what should we share some of our views on the outlook for 2026? Being Nostradamus, what are you predicting next year?
Look, the wine market has had 4 months of positivity. Demand is returning, as we've spoken about. We've had 4 months of the headline indices growing in value. The buying period now is active because Chinese New Year is quite late this year in mid-February. So I think we're going to see a positive January. And that gives us 5 months of solid data that activity is returning. And I think that builds confidence. What the wine market needs confidence to be rebuilt. And I think that we're starting to see that come through now. So I think that historically, when the wine market has been through correction periods, we have seen strong years afterwards. If you think back to the previous correction I mentioned between mid 2011 to the end of 2015, 2016 was a really good year for the market. I think at the end we finished at kind of 17-18%, maybe slightly more for the year. Previously, it's quite a shallow downturn period between kind of end of 2018 and 2019. But we then went on the bull run. Yes, the circumstances were different with the pandemic, but this is the cyclical nature of the wine market. So I am quietly quite confident that it's going to be a good year. Now there's still those kind of slight hesitancies when it comes to this area because it's been a challenging period. But I think we can look at the last kind of 4 or 5 months of that building confidence and think that that's going to continue into this year because there's lots of value around and other assets look quite expensive at this level. Yeah,
and you had a thesis on champagne?
Yeah, so I think just, looking at some of the data and speaking to some suppliers and importers in mainland China, I think champagne has always looked curious to me with China as the largest market. I think in 2023, they imported 900,000 litres. What's that? Kind of 1.2 million bottles. And in 2024, that increased to, I think, 1.4 million litres. But if we spoke about the whole production of Dom Perignon is 5 million bottles, that's not a huge amount across all those producers. So I think that now China is kind of getting to a stage where a lot of the wine buyers are buying wine again. I think that it's going to be an interesting year for champagne in China, and I think that figure is going to tick up close to 2 million litres.
Assuming we get a lot of demand from China for certain champagne brands.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of higher level collectors are really experienced collectors. Yeah. They've been drinking champagne and really interested in champagne for quite a long time. And that's always interesting with China because they're kind of thought leaders when it comes to that. And that will fan out. And I think that will increase. And there's been a lot of, it pairs well with the food, has, good cultural cachet.
Yeah.
It's not actually that popular at the moment. I think it's got a lot of room to grow. And that means that's significant for champagne overall, I think. So I think champagne is something to really watch in China this year.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think from my perspective, we're kind of 30% down from the peak of the market in 22. So I think, look, if you're a long-term lover of fine wine, you're already in the market, or you're someone who wants to get into the market, you got to look at it and think, well, actually, starting to build a collection, starting to add things to your cellar, starting to build out a wine portfolio now feels like a very opportunistic time because prices have come down and it does feel like there's some stability there in the market. I agree with you. Last quarter of the year were good, and we've seen some good data, but it still feels slightly fragile. It's not like there's lots of depth there. And actually, I think once you start broadening out of like the top 150 top names, there's still a lack of liquidity and a lack of market depth. So I think that's probably the point where I think the health of the market would have really returned, when you start seeing that real broad base of demand and market depth. But I do feel like we're on the right pathway to find it. Look, I think in terms of trends for 2026, maybe looking at the short term, I think it's maybe a couple of things that have come out of this data and a couple of things we mentioned. I think looking at all of the wines that traded over 100 times last year all had a negative return, and that compounds from the year before as well. Do I see that happening for a third year in a row? I find it hard to believe that's going to be the case. So I think, to your point, looking at that last quarter, a lot of the wines that are on that list of quarter-on-quarter performance were a lot of the big names. And I think that when the market recovers, the most liquid wines, the most traded wines will be the first to move. So I think if you're just looking at trends for next year, I think the trend for me would be the most liquid wines, the most traded wines will probably fare the best in that kind of initial part of a market recovery. Looking at like that data around Moulton 82, and to your point around some of these kind of mature vintages from the 90s that are coming around, I do definitely feel that there's opportunities for collectors to source and find, original cases of some of those older, rarer vintages now, where I think that, you could get some outsized returns because, there just isn't that much stock and there isn't that much availability. And I think as those wines start to come around and people want to drink them, then, that's where the demand's going to come from. Look, I think the other thing for me, I know you mentioned champagne, but I just think thematically white Burgundy will still do well again this year. I know we've mentioned it a lot. I know it's something that a lot of people talk about, but when it comes to the peak of wine, when it comes to collectors, connoisseurs, of course, Pinot Noir and Burgundy people love, but white Burgundy, there's nothing that can compare to it really. And the market for investment grade collectible white wine is just so narrow. I think we were the other day just sharing some information internally around kind of like the most expensive wines in the world. And of the top 10 most expensive wines in the world, half of them are white wines. And I think if you went to a layman on the street or just someone who doesn't know much about wine and you ask them that question, I think they would be shocked to find out that half of the most expensive bottles of wine you can buy in this world are white wine. And out of that list of, I think, 6 white wines, 5 were from Burgundy. I think one was Egon Muller's TBA. And I just think white Burgundy again will do well, and I think it will continue to do well going forward. And I think it's a trend we saw last year, and I think it's a trend that will continue. And we know 24 is a small vintage that's coming out this month for Burgundy EP, and that's not going to help the availability of those types of wines in the market. So that's probably the 3 things I'm looking out for 2026.
Very good.
That's the end from this special episode of Uncorked, the podcast where we brought you the top wines of 2025. I was joined by my special guest, Joe Alim. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's been a good old job going through this data.
Yeah, we've waded through and you've joined us for it. As I always say, please make sure you like, you subscribe, make sure you follow us on all the usual podcast channels, make sure you follow us on YouTube as well. And as always, like if you have questions or you have anything you want to send us, then please do get in contact, leave us comments on social media or even send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. But thank you very much for joining us once again. And that's goodbye from us.